All right. So I got a great example here for you guys in terms of how not to run a Gen Z sort of like up and coming Democratic progressive kind of candidacy here from Isaiah Martin, who is running for Texas's 18th district to replace Sheila Jackson Lee. And we're basically just going to start off here with his, seems like first initial major campaign advertisement that he's running here. Very heavily focused on the fact that he is a young person, very heavily focused on, things like democracy and the threat of Republicans and all of that stuff. And basically, we're just going to watch through this, and then I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a more perspective or more in-depth perspective on who this guy actually is and why I don't think that he will actually end up appealing to young voters. So let's just go ahead and hear what he has to say here. I'm going to play this at 1.25 times speed directly from his campaign.
We used to take the word democracy for granted. You see, when I grew up, my parents used to take me to vote with them every single time there was an election. You see, back then you probably would have seen me wearing some light-up tennis shoes, wearing the same little I voted sticker that the clerk would give me. Shoot, I'd wear it all day, peel it off, stick it on a new shirt, and wear it to school the next day. You would have thought, in all of these years, that voting would have gotten easier, not harder. But unfortunately, I'm standing right here at ground zero of voter suppression. You see, right here in Texas, Greg Abbott and his allies have created laws that have taken polling places away from line cooks working the night shift. They've thrown out mail-in ballots from seniors who can't drive, and they've empowered the state to have the ability to overturn election results. You see, when I was in college, I led the way for our football stadium to be used as a polling site. And just this past year, they introduced a bill to ban polling sites from college campuses. So, trust me when I tell you, the attack on democracy is real. And I don't want you to think for a second that this is just a Texas thing. Because what we're seeing right here in Texas is just a snapshot of what's going on all across the nation when extremists with no vision try to hold onto power with division. Now more than ever, we need the federal government. I want you to know whether it's strengthening voting rights, protecting our kids from mass shootings, or empowering people on when, if, and how they become a parent, we can tackle big issues when we're relentlessly focused on the future. To the folks, to everybody that's dead set on sending us backwards, well, they're about to find out. My name is Isaiah Martin, and I'm running to become the next Gen Z member of the United States Congress, because democracy is only guaranteed if we fight for it.
Okay. So first thoughts, basically, number one, when I'm looking at a young candidate, right, a Democrat or a, seemingly progressive kind of guy, the main things that I'm looking for is like a very specific set of policy items. Now, maybe that's not what every Gen Z person is specifically looking for, but things that I would be, keeping my eye on would be, where do you stand on Medicare for all? Where do you stand on climate change or like the Green New Deal? Where do you stand on student debt cancellation? Where do you stand on taxing billionaires? Where do you stand on raising the minimum wage to actually be a living wage? Where do you stand on housing prices and getting rent down? I mean, those are sort of like the core things, or maybe even foreign policy agenda items, ending the wars, right? Those would be some of the like things that are at the top of my list. Now, you could, okay, if you're giving him a lot of leeway here, right? Obviously, you could, focus on something like democracy and the threat that Republicans pose to democracy. I think that's a totally fair thing to talk about. I think he's entirely correct in his analysis there in terms of protecting democratic rights for the American people. But I just found it interesting that this guy, specifically focused on the threat that Republicans pose to democracy and abortion rights, which is pretty much like the standard, establishment Democratic messaging at this point, and didn't touch on any of those other core issues that I think a lot of young people are focused on. I mean, keep in mind, you look at the polling data, obviously like climate change, that's the number one issue for young people, right? And all of those other issues that I just mentioned there. And so I thought it was interesting that this guy didn't really mention any of those. And so I was kind of skeptical. I did a little bit more research in terms of who this guy is, and I ended up finding out some pretty interesting information. And so again, take, that advertisement that he just put out there and how energetic he was and how passionate he was about that. And then, we're going to find out a little bit more in terms of what he actually stands for and how, there is this sort of tendency, especially within the Democratic Party, to appeal to young voters, to try to appeal to Gen Z candidates without actually standing for the policies that young people overwhelmingly support. So here from Aaron from Queens, I think he put together a pretty good thread here. So they say, after Isaiah Martin launched his campaign today with support from Voters for Tomorrow and Olivia Juliana and others, it quickly became clear that he is a centrist Zionist with potential Republican sympathies. I'm going to list all of the below in the thread that he's putting together. together here. So he starts off, he says, first, here's Isaiah in 2020 posing for photos with GOP Governor Greg Abbott, okay? And this is at a rally for a GOP candidate, Angelica for Texas, who took tens of thousands from the anti-abortion groups and Clarence Thomas's favorite billionaire sugar daddy, Harlan Crow. Okay, so that's just to start us off. They continue. They say, according to his LinkedIn, along with Mark Cuban, one of Isaiah's interests is Republican and brief Trump press secretary Anthony Scaramucci. Okay, I can't, fault him too much for that. Anthony Scaramucci, kind of an interesting guy to track. But they say also, according to LinkedIn, Isaiah worked as a tough on crime, Houston DA, Kim Oggs assistant campaign manager from 2021 to 2022 after she had just defeated a challenger to her left. And they also say that Ogg, who he worked for, has tried to kick a socialist judge off of the bench and continues to support the death penalty. They say now onto some of his old tweets. In 2020, Isaiah said that transphobe Joe Rogan has the best podcast on air. Right? Probably the single worst thing that you could say. Joe Rogan has the best podcast on air, right? In 2022, Isaiah voiced support for suspending state and federal gas taxes. This April, Isaiah tweeted for the first time about Israel to celebrate its anniversary, potentially in advance of his congressional run. He made several more tweets lauding President Herzog and declaring that Israel is not a racist state. So not a great start here, right? I mean, obviously, I think this is a pretty clear litmus test, at least in my opinion. The idea that maybe you would call an apartheid state that's committing an ethnic cleansing as it is and just admit that it's an apartheid state, but no, he's choosing to run full speed in the opposite direction and defend the government of Israel. They say his Twitter likes include transphobe Keir Starmer and the fascist insurrectionist endorsing group AIPAC, among others. And now for some of his old TikToks, here's Isaiah basically blaming people being released on bail for increased crime and then supporting a constitutional amendment to make cash bail even more strict so even more people can be released, or so that fewer people can be released pre-trial, okay? And here's Isaiah saying that we need more Colin Powells. More Colin Powells, right? The George W. Bush administration, Colin Powell, right? The I'm going to go to the United Nations and lie about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, Colin Powell. That's who he's saying we need more of in the United States of America. And here's his campaign website, which initially included a platform, but which has been completely deleted after intense criticism. And they also say that this person, Olivia Juliana, who apparently follows me on Twitter, has also deleted a tweet of hers praising his abortion platform, as can be seen by this quote tweet. Previous platform highlights include full support for Israel as one of America's longest allies. It hasn't even existed for a century. Support for keeping private health insurance. So he's against Medicare for all. Okay. And no support for making 4-year college free. Okay, so I mean, again, not off to a great start here, and as they just pointed out there, Aaron just pointed out there, he basically, after a lot of backlash, decided to, I guess, completely evaporate the information in terms of what his actual platform is on his website. I did a double check here to go directly to his website and see what's actually on here. You have like the about section, which is like his personal bio, and then you have volunteer and you have donate and all of that, but you don't actually have any of his positions on the actual issues on Medicare for all, on the Green New Deal, on his foreign policy stances, on wages, on fighting for workers. None of that appears actually directly on his congressional run page, which is kind of fucking hilarious, especially considering the fact that you are touting to be sort of like a representative for Gen Z, and you're just not even willing to put up what your actual positions are, right? If you have certain positions that Gen Z would disagree with, that's fine, air them all out, and we'll see whether or not people decide to support your campaign and maybe even volunteer for your campaign. But he decided to completely remove them, I guess, apparently because he realized that he is not a great representative for Gen Z. And so there was this other article that was written up by the Intercept's Prem Thacker, who says Gen Z candidate launches campaign that ignores his generation's priorities. So I'm going to skip down here just to give you guys a little bit more of a rundown. He says in the first bills to co-sponsor section that was previously on his website, right, Martin listed a congressional resolution titled Recognizing Israel as America's Legitimate Democratic Ally. Again, it's an apartheid, can't really call that a democracy, but they say it was introduced last February while Representative Ilhan Omar, the Democrat from Minnesota, fended off bad faith claims of anti-Semitism that led to her expulsion resolution from the Foreign Affairs Committee. And since then, even as Israel has maintained and ramped up its brutal regime over Palestinians, Congress has passed a resolution declaring, quote, "The state of Israel is not a racist or apartheid state." Remember when they did that? Remember when our Congress decided to waste their fucking time literally passing a bill to just say Israel is not an apartheid state, Israel is not a racist state, which they objectively are according to every single reputable human rights organization on the planet, including some that are based within Israel itself, like B'Tselem, including even, previous members of basically the Israeli version of the CIA over there, who some of their top representatives have come out and called it a an apartheid state. So apparently he disagrees with that assessment there, even from people who are within that organization itself. But they say since then, okay, so even after this continuing brutality over Palestinians and Congress passing that law, and also that the United States will always be a staunch partner and supporter of Israel, the candidate has also vocalized his unwavering support for Israel on X, previously known as Twitter, even as Democrats have recently and for the first time become much more sympathetic towards Palestinians than Israelis. And that is what some of the polling data has shown recently, is that within the Democratic constituency, that there is a lot more sympathy for the Palestinian cause relative to obviously recent American history. But they say that Martin's inclusion of the bill is the latest sign that support for Israel will continue to be a fault line in the congressional primaries. In the 2022 cycle, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, Super PAC, spent some $40 million, most of it aimed at defeating progressive candidates and those who spoke up for Palestinian rights or in favor of election denialists, racists, and homophobes. So this is what a lot of the Israeli lobby does, right? It's not as if they are just standing up against like anti-Semitism or any of that. No, they're standing up against any accurate critiques of the government of Israel, which is an apartheid government, and any of their actions, whether that be the ongoing, illegal expansion of settlements, the war crimes, the ethnic cleansing, or any of that stuff. That's what they do, right? They are spending to oppose progressives. They are spending to oppose anybody who is actually honest on the issue of what Israel is actually doing on the ground. And so he seems to be perfectly falling in line with exactly what their priorities are. Now they continue here. They say Martin's platform, which his campaign removed from his website on Wednesday night, included support for the Pro-Worker Protect the Right to Organize Act, the PRO Act, and Reproductive Freedom Bill. So it seems like maybe on some of these issues, he's somewhat falling on the right side of, but at the same time, I'm not really inclined to believe you, given what your stances are on some of these other issues. But they say while his campaign site included pages on issues like voting rights and gun violence, one notable omission was climate change, a dire issue for his generation. A 2021 Pew Research survey found that 37% of Gen Z adults, those born after 1996, say that addressing climate change was their top personal concern. The page also did not include any mention of LGBTQ rights, even as roughly 20% of Gen Z identify as LGBTQ+, and state legislatures, including Martin's own in Texas, are ramping up their attacks on queer people around the country. And on healthcare, Martin endorsed the public option over a universal healthcare option, which is just completely fucking pathetic at every level you want to look at it. And when the time comes, Isaiah will enthusiastically vote yes to create the public option across the United States, which isn't happening because Joe Biden, who ran on the public option as the reasonable alternative to Medicare for all, hasn't mentioned that a single goddamn time throughout the entirety of his administration. So that's not even really on the table as it is. But apparently he says he'll vote for that, won't vote for Medicare for all or advocate for Medicare for all, but he'll vote for public option when it magically, comes across the table. They say an optional government-run healthcare plan that will expand healthcare coverage to Americans while preserving access to private insurance for those who want it, his website read. And Texas's 18th district has voted for a Democratic presidential candidate and House candidate since 1972. It voted for Biden at a clip of 76 to 23 in 2020, and similarly in 2022 for its current House occupant, Sheila Jackson Lee, at roughly a 45% margin. So it's not as if this is like a close Republican district and like, oh, I need to try to play the middle of the road approach and, be this so-called enlightened centrist to try to win this seat. No, this is a solid blue district. They finish off here. They say Martin announced his bid while Sheila Jackson Lee runs for mayor of Houston, and Jackson Lee can still run for her old seat if she doesn't win the mayoral race in November, and she has not yet endorsed any candidate to replace her. And honestly, even if she doesn't win the mayoral race in Houston, I do hope that she holds on to her seat, because at least she is an endorser of Medicare for all, as Martin doesn't seem to be. But they say that Martin has been been interning with Jackson Lee for 2 years, according to the Houston Chronicle, and he interned for her congressional office from June to basically July of 2022, and more recently volunteered for her mayoral campaign. And basically, I mean, that's the rundown on this guy. So, I mean, again, listen, if you're going to be a Gen Z candidate and you're going to sort of make that like the crux of your pitch to voters, especially if you're in the Democratic Party, then I would suggest actually pushing like your issues first, right, and not, you know, dodging the issues and literally deleting them off of your campaign website, and talking about how much of a threat that Republicans are to things like democracy and abortion rights. We all understand those issues, or those are, you know, important key issues. I don't think that, you know, people should just disregard that. I think that obviously voting rights, I think that abortion rights are obviously very key issues, even for young people. But at the same time, you know, it's also as if, you know, it's not as if Democrats are fervently in support of democracy, right? I mean, this is the same party that is fervently against things like ranked choice voting. This is the same party that won't even hold a goddamn primary debate for the presidential election, even as the overwhelming majority don't want Joe Biden to be leading the ticket. And when it comes to abortion rights, I mean, obviously they've had so many chances, whether it's under the Obama administration or otherwise, to actually protect abortion rights. They've been playing on the defense for this entire time. And so it seems like if you're actually going to run sort of a Gen Z focused campaign and be the new, you know, young up and comer, maybe don't run as like a fervently pro-corporate and pro-Israel candidate, and maybe actually, you know, speak to the issues that young people care about, things like climate change, things like wages, things like, you know, Medicare for all, and the other ones that we discussed in this video so far. So to say the least, won't endorse this guy. Don't think that his campaign is legitimate in any way, shape, or form. And I think that he is, you know, honestly just sort of coming across as a stooge for the corporate wing of the Democratic Party.